back with you, and this is our seventh time together looking at the book of Philippians, and we're now going to the start of chapter 4 of Philippians. I'm trying to find my notes here. Here's my notes, and we have a timely section to look at with all that's going on in our world today. It's amazing how that works out, that God's words that was spoken to Philippi, over in around 60 of the Common Era is relative to us today here living in America in the 2021. So in Philippians 4, this is the final chapter of the book of Philippians. We will be looking at what could be one of the issues of Paul's writing the letter. Paul usually has some problem in the community or some issue to deal with in the communities he writes letters to. And in the beginning of chapter 4, we see an issue of disunity in the community, and we'll be looking at his call to bring the community together. And throughout the letter, Paul stresses that disunity is grounded in a lack of humility, that pride is a source of disunity in the community, especially in the Messianic community. It's important that all the people understand the humble example of the Messiah and live out the modeling of the Messiah's example. In verse 1 of chapter 4, we read, "So my brothers, whom I love and long for, my joy and my crown, my dear friends, keep standing firm in union with the Lord." As Paul begins this final chapter of the book, he's speaking here of athletic competition. And as the victor in the athletic competition will receive a prize, usually an olive branch or wreath. We're talking about a crown here. Paul considers the relationship and ministry to the Philippians to be his prize for the faithful service and a great source of joy in his final days. As Paul is coming to the end of his life, he is sharing with the Philippian community that his deep love for them, and that is because of their faithfulness in service to him and their faithfulness to the Messiah, that he really sees them as a prize of his many years of service to the Lord, as he's looking over his life and looking to the soon completion of his journey with his pending execution under Nero. He really rejoices over the fact that the Philippian community really got it. They really understood the message that he had and lived it out, and like him, sought to model the Messiah. Paul shares that the Philippians are great joy to him, and despite his suffering and impending execution, he can rejoice their faith in Yeshua. And they're growing more like the Messiah as a spiritual reward, a crown for their and his faithfulness to God. So as Paul's looking to the end of his life, he sees that one of the great sources of joy and great sources of achievement of his life, that he sees as a crown like a victor would receive in an Olympic event, that the people of Philippi, by following his example of following the Messiah, he can see that as a crown, as a source of joy in his life, despite the difficulties he has being imprisoned and knowing that his impending execution is near. He can rejoice knowing that the people in Philippi are following the example of the Messiah. In verse 2, we come to the issue of the disunity in the community, where we read, "I beg Evodia and I beg Syntyche to agree with each other in union with the Lord." As Paul concludes this letter, he mentions the possible prime reason for this letter, confronting this disunity in the community, because of disagreement between Evodia and Syntyche, two women who were in leadership among the Yeshua believers in Philippi. So as with many things with Paul, he he's writing to people who actually know the issues that he's speaking about. So in this, he doesn't really elaborate what's the problem between Evodia and Syntyche. They're two women of prominence in the Philippian Messianic community. And as we'll see, that he referred to them as fellow workers. So these women had some area of leadership in the Messianic community in Philippi, and they have a disagreement between them. As I said, we don't. Paul being that he's writing to them and they already know the issues going on, he doesn't explain that. So that's kind of something we have to kind of try to discern what could be the point of conflict with them. Whatever that is, there is an issue between these two women. And as we've talked about, the ongoing theme throughout the book of Philippi, to the Philippians, is that Paul's calling the community to model the self-sacrifice and humility of the Messiah. So so given that, we could see there's possibly some issue of lack of service or a lack of humility or a pride issue between these two women leaders in the community. But because of that, there's disunity throughout the whole community. And it's interesting in the opening of the book in verses 1 and 2, where Paul basically gives the who he's addressing the letter to, basically the address label for the letter. He speaks about he keys on that the letter is to the community, but also to the leaders and the shamashim, to the congregational leaders of shamashim, both the zachanim, the elders, and the deacons in the community. And this fits well with this part here in chapter 4, that he wants to be sure that those who get the letter understand that he's calling on those who are in leadership to deal with this leadership problem in Philippi, which is causing disunity throughout the whole community, because the leadership community is in disunion, and by their disunity, they're not reflecting the Messiah. They're not reflecting the unity and the humility and the self-sacrifice of the Messiah that Paul is commending unto them and calling them to model as he models in his life. Paul here in this verse uses the Greek word parakaleo, which means beg, urge, exhort, appeal to. In using this word, he shows the deep importance of this issue to him, that he's begging these two women who are in conflict, that for the sake of their own lives, for their own witness and their own walking following Messiah, and also for the larger community which they affect as leaders, as examples of the community. But Paul uses this word that he's begging them, urging them, exhorting them to come together for the sake of the whole community. And that these two leaders, being in disunity, are setting up a disunity between the whole Philippian community and the whole witness of the Philippian community to those in Philippi and throughout the world. Paul has been dealing with the importance of humility with the positive examples of himself in chapter 1, the ultimate example of humility, Yeshua, our righteous Messiah, in chapter 2. We also see the later part of chapter 2, Timothy and Epaphroditus, who were two people familiar to those in Philippi, who were modeling the Messiah. And also we saw in chapter 3 the contrasting what Dr. David Stern calls the negative example of humility, the example of the pride of the false teachers who were coming to Philippi. And now we see another call here to the importance of following the example of the Messiah, by Paul calling the community, calling these two women, Evodia and Syntyche, to resolve the issue between them for the sake of the community, for the unity and for the modeling of Messiah that must come from the community. Paul's earlier emphasis in the letter on humility, leading unity, sheds light on the issue of pride and lack of humility in the relationship of Evodia and Syntyche, which not only affected them, was also a concern for the whole Philippian Messianic community. As I said, with the importance of leadership, the whole direction of a congregation, the whole direction of the community of faith is dependent on having strong leadership that is in line with the walking in the way of the Messiah, modeling the Messiah. And because of this disunity between these two women leaders in leadership, Evodia and Syntyche, there is disunity that can spread throughout the whole community. And Paul is deeply calling them to resolve whatever issue they have between him. And Paul also in this verse uses the Greek word phroneo, which means referring specifically to the attitude of people to one another. And Paul also used this word in Philippians chapter 2, verse 5, where he was talking about having the same mind as Messiah Yeshua, as he goes into the Messianic hymn, that he wants these two women to be of the same mind, to have the mindset of humility modeled by the Messiah. As we read in Philippians 2:5, it says, that you are to have this same mindset of Messiah Yeshua, who was the model of humility. Paul then is here calling on Evodia and Syntyche to unite for the sake of the community. Paul is reminding these women that their mindset should be that of the Messiah, and calling them to put aside their wrong attitude in order to model Yeshua, who is their ultimate example. Unity in Philippi and with any Messianic community requires the people to follow the example of Yeshua and model his self-sacrificing humility. Such behavior was particularly important for leaders, such as Evodia and Syntyche, who were in a position of influence in their community. As Paul called on the Philippians and us by example to follow his example as he follows the example of the Messiah, he's calling on these women leaders, Evodia and Syntyche, to model the Messiah so that the people in Philippi will see their example and model their example of following the Messiah. As Paul modeled the Messiah, he expected those in leadership to do the same. And we can see how all in our life now, especially in the light of the pandemic and also the various issues of political unrest over this last year, that there's been a lot of people who have been in disunion with one another because of different positions from over the issues of how to deal with the pandemic, the various arguments, stuff over whether people is a pro-mask person or an anti-masker. And we also have seen the tragedy of political unrest from both the left and the right over this last year. And this disunity, sadly enough, is this disunity of our large society has sadly worked its way into the life of our Messianic community, and we need to understand that our focus needs to be on modeling Messiah and seeking to find unity in our diversity. We can have different ways of looking at things, but our call is to be one in the Messiah. And as we see this great concern of disunity in Philippi because of the poor example of Evodia and Syntyche and their issue of disunion, Paul called from them deeply for the sake of themselves and for the larger community, for them to come together. We need today in our lives to seek to model the Messiah and to model the humility that he showed us, and to seek to to model him, and especially for those who are in leadership, to be a model of the unity that we have in Messiah, and as a model of that Messiah-like example of humility. You know, as pride was an issue in Philippi, which brought disunion between these two leaders in the community. You know, we have to deal with pride in our own lives, and seek to rid that which causes disunion amongst the community. In verse 3, you can continue on, and Paul says, "I request you, loyal Syzygus, to help these women, for they have worked hard proclaiming the good news with me, along with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers, whose names are in the book of life." So Paul here appeals to Syzygus, which is a proper name in Dr. David's, in the Complete Jewish Bible, and also in other translations they just translate the word, which means fellow worker or co-worker, to refer to this person, basically a third party that Paul is calling in to be a source of counsel to these women who are in these leaders who are in conflict. And he calls on Syzygus, this fellow worker, to help bring unity in the community by assisting Evodia and Syntyche to resolve issues that divide them. So now Paul has called on them to work things out, and also called on another leader in the community, Syzygus, his fellow worker, person he's familiar with, to assist these women to just deal with whatever the issue that they're having between them, whatever is causing the disunion, which threatens the whole of the community. And this is important to see that there's an important role to play for others in leadership when there is disunity among those on the leadership team, the leadership groupings, that it's important for those who are walking in the example of the Messiah to step up and to be a source of counsel, a source of calling those who are out of union with the Messiah and out of union with one another to come back together. And here we see Syzygus stepping up and being called to take on this important role of being a peacemaker between these two leaders who are in conflict. And here Paul referred to Evodia and Syntyche as his fellow workers, a relative of a close working relation with Paul in ministry. So not only were these women in a role of leadership in the community, but Paul is also saying that they're fellow workers with him, that he has actually worked with them in ministry. So he knows these two women, he cares deeply for them, and he knows that for their betterment, for the betterment of the Messianic community in Philippi, he calls them to come together and to have the same mind and the same unity that he calls the whole community to. Like Paul, they would have faced persecution for their commitment to the work of spreading the good news of Messiah. So these are people that these two women are people that Paul is familiar with and has served side by side with them, and they, like him, have had to face persecution for their faith. So he's calling them, you've stood strong throughout your time as a follower of Yeshua. Now I'm calling you back to union with one another, that to model that unity of the Messiah. As leaders in the community, their lack of unity affects the whole of the Messianic community in Philippi. Throughout his letter, Paul calls the Philippians to unity, to unite by modeling the humility of Yeshua. And here, as he closes the letter, he calls for unity and humility to begin among the leaders of the community, especially Evodia and Syntyche, as they, like Paul, serve examples up for the people. the importance of Evodian Syntyche is that they have a position of a prominence in the community, and they are in a position of being an example to the community. So Paul calls them, as they are to model the Messiah, they need to be a model for others in the Messianic community to see the unity and the humble self-sacrifice of Yeshua. In addressing the conflict between these two women leaders, Paul stresses the importance of accountability for all in the Philippian community, from the leaders to everyone. Paul's emphasis on the importance of the leaders here, serving the examples of the Messiah, as a theme throughout the letter. Just as Paul uses himself, Timothy, Epaphroditus, and in this verse, Clement, as examples, he also wants Evodian Syntyche to resolve the disunity, looking examples of Messiah to those over which they have influence. As I said earlier, in the opening of the letter, Paul addresses the congregational leaders in Shamashim, clarifying that Philippi had an established leadership structure, and he wanted to make sure the Philippian Messianic community leaders were listening to his example. Making the point that this is his one letter that he actually refers to the leadership of the community in the address. Is important here, because as he comes to the end of this letter, he's speaking about an issue of leadership in the community. As leaders of the community model the Messiah, their example should draw the people to follow the examples of Yeshua. Paul places great importance on the unity and Messiah-like modeling of the leaders as they model the Messiah. And he makes clear his intent to bring Evodian and Syntyche back together as one in the Messiah, for their own sake as well as for the betterment of the community. So the call here is to Evodian and Syntyche to resolve the issues between them, but also Paul is calling on all those who are in leadership in Philippi to come with these women who are in conflict and seek to bring them back together so there would be a unified body of Messiah in Philippi, and that they could all work for the glorification of God and for moving the community forward. Since the Philippians highly value their Roman citizenship and the prominence of Philippi as a Roman colony, Paul declares that through their faith in Yeshua, they have even greater citizenship. We talked about that last week. We're in Philippians 3:20, where it talks about that we are citizens of heaven. So Paul here is talking about the citizenship in heaven by being written in the book of life. So after Paul has dealt here in these first few verses with the issue of disunity in the community, this disunion between Evodian and Syntyche, and called on them to work out whatever their issues are, whatever issues of pride or not living in union with one another, not modeling the Messiah, and he calls on Syzygus and Clement and other leaders to step up and to assist them in coming back into union. Paul goes on in verse 4 to say, "Rejoice in union with the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice." So after dealing with this issue of disunity, Paul moves in these next verses to focus on the life of following the Messiah and calling people to understand the joy that there is in Messiah. Here Paul calls Philippians in this famous verse to rejoice, not as a temporary feeling or emotion, but as joy that has a staying power based on their faith commitment to Yeshua. This joy is not just an emotion, but an authentic experience of God's faithfulness. And it's a continued promise of guidance, provision, protection, and direction. So Paul here is dealing with this important, heavy issue of the disunity between Evodian and Syntyche. And now he moves on to speak about the joy that they can and should have as followers of the Messiah. And this is not a as I said, not a joy which is just an outward emotion, but a deep inner experience of knowing God through the Messiah, knowing God's faithfulness, and knowing that he has kept his promises, and he will continue to keep his promises and provide for, protect, and guide. The cause for the Philippians rejoicing is the good news that the Messiah will soon return, and that they, along with all the redeemed, will enter the Messianic kingdom and the new life forever with Yeshua. This assurance of death's defeat guarantees the righteous eternal reign of Messiah would begin. So Paul here is now focusing the mind of those in Philippi on the deep joy that they should have because of their connection with the God of Israel through their faith, trust in Messiah. And that this is a deep inner joy based on God's faithfulness. And because of God's faithfulness to his promises, he is faithful to deliver them through the difficulties of the world that they live in. In verse 5, we read, "Let everyone see how reasonable and gentle you are. The Lord is near." And this here can also be tied to the example of, as the leadership of the community of Syntyche and Evodia, we talked about earlier, that their example of the community was in disarray because of their conflict between them. And Paul here now, in addressing the whole of the community, says that everyone should be reasonable and gentle. The Lord is near. So Paul is now committing to the whole community that they need to follow the example of the Messiah and live reasonable and gentle lives, and lives that are modeling of the Messiah, that the whole community is responsible for their life in Messiah, and all of them need to model the Messiah's example of humble self-sacrifice and willingness to serve others. So not only the leaders, but also all the people are to be examples of the Messiah. In verse 6, and this will be closing our time together today, we come to this verse. "Don't worry about anything. On the contrary, make your requests known to God by prayer and petition with thanksgiving." In this memorable verse, verse 6, chapter 4 is full of many verses that people are familiar with and are well remembered and recited. But this verse 6, we see the teaching of the Philippians about the importance of prayer as a source of breaking from worry. The greatest counter to worrying is to place all concerns on God in prayer. And Dr. Stern, in his Jewish New Testament commentary, made it a powerful point about this verse. So often you just figure it's like that, just saying, don't worry, that, there's just that we are to make our request known to God by prayer and petition, which is a good thing because we know that God is our source of life. But Dr. Stern, in his commentary, made the interesting and really, really life-changing comment on this verse, that he says that in this verse, Paul is calling the Messianic community in Philippi and us to, by example, to understand our full dependence on God, and that we see that there is a sense of combating pride, continuing the humility throughout the book. That Dr. Stern says that by not taking everything to God in prayer, there's a sense of pride in our own self that basically I can take care of this. I don't need to pray about, my job is going good. I don't need to bring that to God. I've got that under control, but, I'm having, difficulty with this issue with a family member. So that's an issue I'll take to God in prayer. But no, Dr. Stern here is really makes the point that It's a matter of our complete dependence on God and our complete rejection of pride. That by not taking everything to God in prayer, somehow saying, I can take care of this, I can take care of that. This I need to bring to prayer. I'm concerned about. I'm concerned about a friend who tests positive for COVID. That's a big issue, so I'll bring that to prayer. This issue here, well, I can take care of this disagreement with one of my coworkers. But what we have here is a call that we need to bring everything to God in prayer. And in that we show our dependence on him and that he is our source for everything. And that's no longer I can do some things, God can do some things, but our only source is God. God is the one who brings all together. And in this, we see Paul teach about humility in the case of humbly bringing all issues to God in prayer. The greatest act of humility is to lay all one's needs before God, knowing that he is the source of life and the true Lord and King, that he is the one that is the source of all that we need. And by not taking things to God in prayer, we are in essence saying, well, I can do that on myself. That it's no longer God is the one that is the source of everything, but I can do this. We'll bring the big things to him. I'll take care of the small things. But no, we're called to here, as Dr. Stern is focuses on, is that all things we need to bring to God in prayer to show our humble acceptance of him as our source of everything. The greatest act of humility, as I said, is to lay all one's needs before God, knowing that he is the source of life and the true Lord and King. It's in this time of prayer, the Philippians can bring their most heartfelt needs and concerns before God. Simple prayers like the ones Paul is recommending to the Philippians are so important, and so in seeking to be humble servants of our Lord, understand that God, Yeshua the Messiah, is our source of life. And as we bring all of our concerns to God in prayer, we show his lordship over his life. He is the only one that we can bring these needs and concerns to. So in doing that, we show our dependence on him. We show that we are followers, and we are the ones who know that he is our only source of life. So this is what we're going to look at today, the first 6 verses of chapter 4. And next week we'll be looking at a later part of chapter 4 and conclude our 8 weeks of study here in the book of Philippians, which is amazing. This was our 7th week together. So as we're talking about the importance of prayer, I'd like to close in a word of prayer, and we will continue on with our service.